The grand concert hall was alive with a sense of excitement that seemed to buzz in the air. Chandeliers hung like clusters of stars, casting a warm golden glow over the polished wooden floors and plush velvet seats. Everywhere you looked, people were dressed in their finest, from tailored suits to elegant gowns, their eyes shining with anticipation. Tonight, a famous pianist would perform a musician known not just for skill, but for a showmanship that drew audiences from far and wide. The hall had been filled for hours, and even now, the murmurs of the crowd carried a mix of excitement and pride, as if everyone wanted to be part of history. Backstage, the famous pianist was preparing. His fingers, long and lean, flexed over the keys of the grand piano, testing their strength even in private. He was calm, almost too calm, as if he already knew the audience would hang on every note he played. Yet behind that calmness, there was a playful side, a streak of mischief that made him unpredictable. Those who knew him well said he enjoyed keeping the crowd on edge, finding ways to surprise and entertain beyond the music itself. Tonight, it seemed, he might be in a particularly playful mood. As the hall slowly filled, the audience's chatter created a soft hum. Children sitting in their parents' laps fidgeted with anticipation, and elderly couples leaned forward slightly, eager to catch every detail. Music lovers from all walks of life had come together, some who played instruments themselves, others who simply enjoyed the thrill of listening to talent unfold live. It was a mixture of people who knew music intimately and those who felt it in their hearts. And tonight, it was all for the same experience, the performance of a lifetime. In a quiet corner, slightly away from the main crowd, a woman sat alone. She wasn't dressed in extravagant clothing, nor did she have a sense of self-importance. Her clothes were simple, her shoes worn but clean, and she held herself with a quiet confidence that came from knowing her own worth. She watched the room with calm curiosity, noticing the elegance of the hall and the excitement of the people around her. But more than that, her attention was fixed on the piano itself. Even from a distance, she could feel the weight of the instrument, the promise of sound waiting within its strings. She wasn't here to perform tonight, at least not officially. She had come to watch, to soak in the music, and to be reminded of why she had devoted so many years of her life to learning and teaching it. The audience's chatter began to settle as the lights dimmed slightly, signaling that the performance was about to start. A hush fell over the room, as if the crowd collectively held its breath. The pianist walked onto the stage, his presence commanding yet relaxed. People leaned forward, their attention fully captured. There was a confident smile on his face, one that suggested he was about to give them a show they would never forget. The pianist approached the piano and lifted the lid with a flourish, his movements practiced but graceful. The room was silent now, every ear straining to catch the first note. Then something unusual happened. The pianist's eyes moved toward the woman sitting quietly in the corner. She had not been part of the official program, and yet there was something about her presence that caught his attention. Perhaps it was the way she observed the piano, her posture relaxed yet attentive, or perhaps it was a deeper sense he couldn't quite name. In any case, a mischievous idea seemed to spark in his mind. He turned to the audience with a playful grin, as if he had just thought of a new game. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice smooth and confident, carrying clearly to every corner of the hall. "We have a little surprise tonight." The audience leaned in slightly, curious but unaware of what was about to unfold. "We have a special guest," he continued, gesturing toward the woman in the corner, "who will join me at the piano." A few polite murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some eyebrows raised in surprise. Others exchanged puzzled glances, trying to understand what was happening. The woman blinked in surprise herself. She hadn't expected to be noticed, let alone called on stage. She looked around at the audience, feeling the weight of their gaze. It was a mix of curiosity, skepticism, and amusement. She could sense the unspoken thought in many minds. Who is she? And why is she going to play? Her heart began to race, a strange mixture of nervousness and excitement swirling inside her. She had played piano countless times, but never in front of such a large, elite audience without prior notice. The pianist, noticing her hesitation, added with a playful tone, "Don't worry. I promise it won't hurt. Just come up and play a few notes for us." The audience laughed lightly at the joke, thinking it was part of the entertainer's charm. Many assumed this was a humorous interlude, a light-hearted moment before the real performance began. Few could imagine what was truly about to happen. The woman took a deep breath, pushing aside doubt and fear. She reminded herself why she had learned music in the first place, not for applause, not for recognition, but because music was a part of her soul. Her fingers itched to touch the keys, to bring sound into the silent room. Slowly, deliberately, she stood and walked toward the stage. Each step seemed to echo in the hushed hall. The audience watched intently, some leaning forward with curiosity, others smiling politely, still assuming this was a joke. As she reached the piano, the famous pianist stepped aside, gesturing gracefully for her to sit. The woman lowered herself onto the piano bench, her posture careful and poised. The keys stretched out before her, gleaming under the warm lights. She placed her hands gently on the keyboard, feeling the smoothness of the keys beneath her fingers. For a moment, everything else faded: the audience, the chandeliers, the murmurs of surprise. All that existed was the piano and the music, waiting to be born. The audience's laughter and murmurs slowly disappeared as they realized she was not hesitating, not fumbling, not playing randomly. There was a stillness in the hall, a quiet expectation. People sensed that something significant was about to happen, though they didn't know exactly what. They could feel it in the air, the kind of tension that comes before witnessing something extraordinary. Even the pianist, known for his sharp eye and judgment, seemed slightly intrigued. He leaned back a little, watching her hands as they hovered above the keys. His usual smirk replaced by an expression of curiosity. The woman's heart beat steadily, yet with a rhythm that mirrored the music forming in her mind. She had spent years practicing alone, teaching herself to interpret not just the notes, but the emotion behind them. She could feel the stories embedded in the piano, waiting for her to tell them. And now, here she was, faced with hundreds of eyes, all watching, all judging, yet she was ready to share her gift. She pressed the first note, softly, almost hesitantly at first. The sound floated into the air, delicate and pure. Immediately, the hall seemed to change. The audience, who had expected a short, humorous interlude, froze. Some leaned closer to listen, disbelief growing on their faces. The notes were precise, fluid, and carried an emotion that seemed far beyond what anyone had imagined from a stranger called on stage as a joke. The woman's fingers moved naturally, each note flowing into the next, creating a melody that was both beautiful and haunting. People held their breath, caught in the sudden transformation of the moment. The pianist's expression shifted. A hint of admiration crossed his face, quickly replaced by fascination. He had seen many talented musicians in his life, but there was something different about her playing, something genuine and powerful that couldn't be taught or faked. The audience's laughter from moments ago had vanished entirely. In its place was awe, curiosity, and a growing excitement. Every note she played told a story, each one more compelling than the last, and the room seemed to vibrate with the energy she created. As the first melody began to rise, it was clear that this was no ordinary performance. The woman was not just playing notes. She was speaking through the piano. Her music was a bridge connecting her heart to everyone in the room. People were drawn in, unable to look away or even blink, as if missing a single sound might mean losing a part of the magic. Conversations had ceased, phones were lowered, and all eyes were fixed on the humble figure at the piano. Even those who had arrived expecting to be entertained by a famous performer were now witnessing something entirely unexpected. They had come for the known, the celebrated, the polished performance of a star. Instead, they were seeing raw talent, a hidden gem revealing itself in real time. The contrast was striking, and it made the moment even more powerful. The woman's playing continued, and though her hands moved with confidence, her mind remained fully aware of the gravity of the situation. She knew she had a choice: to let fear control her, or to let the music guide her. She chose the latter, letting the melody take shape as naturally as breath leaving her lungs. And as she played, the audience realized that this moment, this unexpected turn of events, was not just entertainment, it was something far rarer. A genuine connection between a musician and the listeners, forged in the most surprising of circumstances. The first few minutes passed like seconds, yet they carried the weight of a lifetime of practice, patience, and passion. The woman had become the center of the hall, not because she had planned it, but because the music demanded attention. The famous pianist, watching from the side, seemed almost forgotten by the crowd as her. The applause from the first few notes still lingered in the air, vibrating softly through the wooden floors of the grand hall. People were still processing what had just happened. The woman at the piano had taken a moment meant as a joke and transformed it into a scene of pure music, leaving the audience breathless. Yet despite the admiration filling the room, the woman herself felt a quiet tension, a mixture of nerves and excitement. She knew the real challenge had just begun. The first piece had been an introduction, almost a whisper of what she was truly capable of. Now she had to decide whether to continue or retreat, and the decision weighed heavily on her. She adjusted her posture slightly, letting her hands rest gently on the keys. The audience watched her expectantly, their curiosity growing with every second. The hall had shifted in mood. What had started as a casual performance had turned into a moment of suspense, and the energy in the room was palpable. People who had been polite and cautious now leaned forward, eyes wide, ears straining for the next note. Some whispered to their neighbors, voices tinged with disbelief, asking each other who this woman was and where she had learned to play so beautifully. The famous pianist, who had called her up as a joke, was still on the side of the stage. His usual playful demeanor had softened, replaced by something closer to respect. He watched her carefully, observing the movement of her fingers, the ease with which she controlled the dynamics of the piano. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. Her hands moved as if they were extensions of her own thoughts. Even he could sense the depth of emotion she was capable of evoking. And it was becoming clear that the audience was witnessing something far more than a simple melody dot as she began the second piece. The notes came out more confidently than before. Each chord was deliberate, precise, and carried a subtle intensity that drew listeners in. The melodies seemed to speak directly to the hearts of those in the room, touching memories, emotions, and thoughts that had nothing to do with music theory. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them, while others sat rigid, astonished by the control and expression she displayed. The woman herself felt a rush of energy as she played. It was as if the music had taken control of her hands, guiding her to play not just with skill, but with her entire being. The audience's perception began to shift further. Those who had initially chuckled at the idea of an impromptu performer now found themselves fully engaged, leaning closer to absorb every nuance. The hall was silent, except for the sound of the piano, and even the air seemed to hold its breath. There were subtle expressions on faces that told stories of their own lips parted in awe, eyes glistening with emotion, and hands gripping armrests tightly as though trying to anchor themselves to the reality of the moment. The music was no longer background. It had become the center of everyone's attention. Meanwhile, the woman felt a growing sense of connection with the crowd. She was no longer just performing. She was communicating. Each note carried intention, each pause a gentle nudge for the audience to feel, reflect, and understand. She could sense their surprise, their disbelief, and even their admiration, and that awareness gave her an added layer of courage. The fear she had felt moments ago was fading, replaced by a quiet confidence that this was exactly where she was meant to be. Her fingers glided effortlessly over the keys, weaving a story that was both personal and universal. Backstage, technicians and staff who had been watching from the wings began to exchange glances. They had seen many talented musicians in their careers, but the aura surrounding this performance was different. It wasn't just the technical skill. It was the emotional resonance that seemed to fill every corner of the hall. The way the woman's music moved from delicate whispers to bold, sweeping chords created a sense of intimacy and grandeur simultaneously. It was as if the piano had become an extension of her soul, carrying feelings too complex for words alone. The famous pianist finally stepped closer, intrigued. He had spent years on stage, performing for countless audiences, and yet he had rarely felt the surprise and admiration that now filled him. He could hear the subtle variations in tempo, the way she accentuated certain notes, and the precision of her timing. But more importantly, he could feel the emotion behind it, the way she told a story not through spoken words, but through the music itself. It was the kind of performance that could leave a mark on anyone who listened carefully. A moment that would be remembered for years. The woman's focus remained entirely on the piano, yet she was acutely aware of the audience's reaction. She noticed the little details, the way a man near the front clenched his jaw, as if holding back disbelief, or how a woman in the balcony leaned forward, her hand trembling slightly as she reached toward her heart. Every response seemed to fuel her performance, creating a loop of energy between her and the listeners. The hall had transformed from a space for formal entertainment into a living, breathing exchange of emotion. Minutes passed, though they felt like seconds, and the woman moved seamlessly from one piece to another. Her repertoire seemed endless, flowing naturally, without hesitation or error. The audience could not believe what they were witnessing. Some had assumed she was an accomplished musician, perhaps a teacher or a student with exceptional talent, but few could have predicted the level of mastery and emotion she displayed. It was as if she had been waiting for this exact moment, and the piano had been waiting for her all along. The famous pianist's earlier jest now felt distant, almost irrelevant. He had thought it would be amusing to place an unexpected performer on stage, expecting polite applause or perhaps a laugh. Instead, he was witnessing a genuine musical revelation, a display of skill and expression that rivaled any professional concert he had attended. His eyes followed every movement of her hands, and a slow smile of admiration spread across his face. He had underestimated her, and the realization humbled him. People in the audience began whispering to each other, their voices low but full of awe. "Who is she?" someone asked quietly. Another replied, "I have never heard anything like this in my life." Children and adults alike were captivated, their attention fully absorbed. Even those who came with casual curiosity now felt a deep connection to the music, and it was clear that everyone present would leave with a story to tell. The woman had turned what was meant as a joke into a profound experience for everyone in the hall. As the performance continued, the woman introduced subtle variations in rhythm and dynamics, exploring the emotional range of each piece. She could feel the audience responding, adjusting her playing slightly to enhance the effect. The connection between performer and listener grew stronger with every note, creating a shared moment that was intimate and public at the same time. People felt as though they were part of something extraordinary. a memory that would linger in their minds long after the concert ended. The famous pianist, now fully engaged, could not help but acknowledge her skill internally. He had spent years studying technique, mastering complex compositions, and performing in front of demanding audiences. Yet here was someone, unknown to him, drawing out reactions that he rarely witnessed, captivating listeners with a purity and depth of feeling that went beyond technical proficiency. The performance was more than music. It was storytelling, emotion, and artistry combined into a single, unforgettable experience. In the middle of the performance, the woman paused briefly, letting the last note resonate through the hall. Silence returned, but it was different this time. It was a silence full of anticipation, as though the audience were collectively holding their breath, waiting for what would come next. Some people had tears in their eyes. Others looked stunned, their expressions a mixture of admiration and disbelief. The woman's heart raced slightly, not from fear, but from the awareness of the impact she was having. She had captured something intangible, something that could not be taught or measured, and she felt its weight and responsibility. Then she continued, her hands moving with renewed confidence and grace. The melody became more intricate, layering harmonies that danced across the keys. Every note seemed intentional, as if she were telling a story with twists, tension, and release. The audience was mesmerized, unable to look away, and the hall seemed to vibrate with energy. Even those who had come expecting light entertainment were now fully immersed, feeling every emotion conveyed through the piano. By the end of this second segment, the woman had solidified her presence as more than a surprise guest. She had become the center of attention, the heart of the evening, and the embodiment of musical expression. The famous pianist stepped back slightly, his eyes reflecting genuine respect. What had begun as a playful joke had transformed into a revelation, a moment that redefined expectations and left everyone in awe. The audience erupted into applause again, this time louder and more enthusiastic. People stood, cheering and clapping, some whistling softly, others calling out words of admiration. The energy in the hall was electric, charged with appreciation for something rare and unexpected. Conversations broke out in whispers, questions about who she was and how she had learned to play. But everyone agreed on one thing. They had witnessed something extraordinary. As the applause settled, the woman took a quiet breath, her fingers resting lightly on. The applause from the audience had just begun to fade when the woman at the piano took a brief moment to breathe. Her hands hovered over the keys, feeling the weight of the instrument, the echo of the notes that had just filled the hall still resonating in her mind. She was aware that everyone's attention was on her, yet she felt no fear, only a quiet determination to continue sharing what had come from years of practice, patience, and a deep love for music. This was no longer just an impromptu performance. It was a conversation between her and the audience, a language beyond words that spoke directly to the heart. She started the next piece slowly, letting the notes emerge softly, almost tentatively, yet with an unmistakable precision. The melody was delicate, almost fragile, and it seemed to float above the audience, touching each listener in a different way. Some closed their eyes, letting the music paint pictures in their minds. Others leaned forward, captivated by the technical skill and the emotion that each note carried. There was a sense of intimacy in the performance, as if she were inviting the audience into a private moment that they were lucky to witness. The famous pianist stood to the side, still watching closely. His earlier amusement at the idea of calling someone from the audience had completely vanished. He had underestimated her entirely. Every subtle movement of her fingers, every expression of her hands and body, spoke of mastery that could not be learned quickly or faked. He was witnessing something rare, a combination of technical brilliance and deep, emotional expression that seemed to flow naturally from her. It was not simply a performance. It was storytelling. As the piece progressed, the tempo began to shift, growing slightly faster, then slowing again in a way that was both unexpected and perfectly controlled. The audience could feel the tension and release in the music, as though she were guiding them through a journey. Each crescendo carried weight. Each silence between notes was deliberate, drawing listeners into the moment. The hall, filled with hundreds of people, seemed to become a single entity, breathing in unison with the music. There was a collective understanding that what they were experiencing was extraordinary, a rare gift of human talent shared freely and unexpectedly. She moved seamlessly from one section to another, her hands dancing over the keys with a natural fluidity. The notes seemed to carry stories of longing, joy, sorrow, and hope. There was a sense of familiarity in the way she played, as if the melodies had been part of her life for decades. And yet there was a freshness that made the music feel alive and urgent. The audience could feel it, each person reacting in their own way, some nodding subtly, others letting a tear slip down their cheek, all of them captivated by the performance. The famous pianist couldn't help but be drawn into the spell. He had performed on countless stages, in front of audiences that demanded perfection, yet he rarely felt the kind of emotional resonance that now filled the hall. Watching her play, he realized that she had something even he sometimes struggled to achieve, the ability to make music feel alive, to connect with people in a profound way. Every note she played carried intent, purpose, and feeling. He had called her on stage as a joke, and instead of being embarrassed, she had completely transformed the moment. Back in the audience, whispers spread quietly at first, then grew as people tried to articulate what they were feeling. "She's amazing," one person whispered. "I've never heard anyone play like this," another said. Even the children in the front rows, who had been fidgeting earlier, were now utterly still, their eyes fixed on her fingers, watching the story unfold in real time. The effect of her music was subtle yet powerful. It drew people in without them realizing how deeply it touched them. She had reached a point in the piece where the melody grew more complex, intertwining high, delicate notes with deeper, resonant chords. The contrast created a tension that the audience could feel in their chests, a sort of emotional pull that made every heart beat faster. The famous pianist's eyes widened slightly. He had seen many skilled musicians, but the way she navigated the complexities of the piece with such ease, while simultaneously conveying emotion, was remarkable. Every movement was intentional, every note carefully considered yet infused with life. Her concentration was absolute. She was aware of the audience, yes, but her focus was on the music itself. It was as if the piano had become an extension of her thoughts, her feelings, and her memories. The music flowed naturally, sometimes delicate, sometimes forceful, creating a tapestry of sound that enveloped the hall. Listeners could feel the layers of emotion without understanding every technical detail, which made the experience even more powerful. Music, in its purest form, was connecting everyone in the room to the performer, and it was happening effortlessly. The famous pianist, now standing silently to the side, found himself learning from her in real time. He had spent years perfecting his technique, studying masters of the past, and performing for audiences that often praised technical skill over emotional depth. But here was someone who embodied both, seemingly without effort, showing that music could transcend technique alone. He could feel the audience's energy shifting, the room becoming alive in response to her touch, and he realized that she had completely redefined what it meant to perform. Minutes passed, but no one seemed to notice the time. The audience was lost in the music, suspended in a moment that felt timeless. The woman's fingers moved with elegance and confidence, yet there was a human touch in every note, the slight hesitation before a key, the gentle pressure, the subtle lift of a hand that reminded listeners that this was not just performance, but human expression. Each chord seemed to carry a story, each pause a reflection of thought or feeling. The music had become a language, one that needed no translation, understood by every soul in the hall. As the piece continued, the woman began to explore dynamics more boldly, letting her emotions guide the intensity of each note. The highs soared, sparkling and brilliant, while the lows resonated deeply, shaking the floorboards ever so slightly. The audience could feel the power of her playing physically, as if the vibrations themselves carried emotion into their bones. Some sat forward in their seats, entranced, while others closed their eyes to better absorb the layers of sound. The hall was no longer a passive space. It had become an active participant in the music. The famous pianist's earlier mischief had completely vanished. He had intended the moment as a playful diversion, expecting polite applause or light amusement. Instead, he had been given an unexpected lesson in the power of talent, humility, and emotional honesty. He watched her with quiet admiration, seeing how she held the audience in her hands without trying to impress or dominate. The music itself became the star, and she was merely the vessel, guiding everyone through its beauty. She noticed the subtle changes in the audience, the way their breathing synchronized with the rhythm, the way their eyes followed her hands as if trying to memorize the magic of the moment. She felt an unspoken connection, a dialogue happening silently but clearly, as if every person was responding emotionally to what she was conveying. The hall had become a shared space of understanding, a place where music had broken down barriers and created unity. As she neared the final section of the piece, she allowed herself a small, private smile. She had been nervous at first, uncertain of how her music would be received, but now she could feel the collective appreciation of everyone present. This was more than applause. It was recognition of the honesty, effort, and emotion she poured into her performance. She had taken a simple piano, a familiar instrument, and turned it into a conduit for something much larger, a moment of shared humanity. The hall was silent again, but this time it was not the silence of expectation. It was the silence of awe. People were holding their breath, reluctant to break the spell that had been cast. The famous pianist stepped forward slightly, his own expression betraying the amazement he felt. He had called her on stage as a joke, expecting laughter or mild interest, and instead had witnessed a performance that would linger in memory long after the night ended. He knew, without a doubt, that this woman's talent was extraordinary, and that the audience recognized it too. That her hands moved over the keys one final time, blending the intricate harmonies into a single, resonant chord that seemed to echo endlessly. The notes hung in the air, delicate and strong at the same time, as if the piano itself were breathing. The audience sat still, captivated, feeling the culmination of the music deep in their hearts. And then, slowly, almost reluctantly, the spell was broken by the first wave of applause. The clapping began softly, polite at first, but quickly grew into a roaring acknowledgment of what they had witnessed. People stood, cheered, and whistled, their faces reflecting astonishment and admiration. Some wiped tears from their eyes, unable to hold back emotion. Others laughed quietly, shaking their heads in disbelief, as if to remind themselves that this had really happened. The performance had exceeded all expectations. Leaving the hall buzzing with excitement and wonder, the woman finally lifted her hands from the keys. Breathing deeply, feeling both exhausted and exhilarated, she looked out at the audience and saw the amazement mirrored in every face. It was overwhelming, yet deeply gratifying. For years, she had played piano alone, teaching he. The applause from the last piece had barely settled when the woman at the piano felt a sudden surge of energy. Her heart was still racing, but it was no longer nervous energy, it was excitement, the kind that comes from being fully alive in a moment you are meant to be in. She glanced briefly at the famous pianist standing nearby, still watching her with a mixture of respect and awe. He had called her to the stage as a joke, expecting laughter or polite applause, and instead, she had captivated everyone in the hall. It was a moment neither of them would forget, and yet she felt that the performance was far from over. Her fingers hovered above the keys, feeling the cool smoothness beneath her touch. She could sense the anticipation in the room, the quiet energy that had grown after the last piece. People were leaning forward in their seats, eyes wide, waiting to see what would come next. There was a collective understanding that the evening had transformed into something extraordinary, something more than a simple concert. The music was no longer just notes on a page. It was a shared experience, a conversation between the performer and everyone listening. She began again, this time with a piece that demanded more technical skill. The melody was intricate, full of rapid notes that danced across the keys, requiring precise timing and control. Her hands moved swiftly, yet gracefully, as if the piano were an extension of herself. The audience watched in silent awe, unable to look away as her fingers weaved a tapestry of sound that was both complex and emotionally powerful. The famous pianist's earlier amusement had completely vanished. He had underestimated her, and now he was witnessing a level of skill that rivaled the best he had ever seen. As the piece continued, she allowed herself to become fully immersed in the music. Her body moved with the rhythm, her eyes occasionally closing as she followed the flow of the melody. She was no longer thinking about the audience or the expectations. They had faded into the background. All that mattered was the music itself, the way it poured from her heart, through her hands, and into the room. The hall seemed to vibrate with energy, as if the walls themselves were responding to the passion in her playing. The audience was captivated. Some had leaned back in their chairs, letting the sound wash over them, while others were on the edge of their seats, hanging on every note. The children in the front row were completely still, their eyes following her hands as if trying to understand the magic she was creating. Adults were equally entranced, many with tears forming in their eyes, moved by the depth of emotion she conveyed. It was a rare kind of performance, one that spoke to everyone differently, yet universally. The famous pianist moved closer, unable to hide his admiration. He had performed for countless audiences, yet he rarely felt such a profound impact. He had always focused on technical perfection, but watching her play reminded him of what music could truly be: an expression of human emotion, a story told without words. Her hands danced over the keys with confidence and precision, but it was the soul behind the notes that left him stunned. Every chord, every pause, every subtle shift in tempo seemed to communicate something deep and personal. She transitioned seamlessly into a slower, more reflective section of the piece. The notes softened, delicate and gentle, yet full of meaning. It was a contrast to the rapid sequences from before, but the shift was effortless, natural, and captivating. The audience leaned in, listening intently, sensing the emotions behind each note. Some whispered to each other, sharing their thoughts quietly, though many remained silent, overwhelmed by the beauty unfolding before them. The music had become a living presence in the hall, one that could be felt physically as well as emotionally. The woman's expression changed subtly as she played. Her eyes closed occasionally, her brows furrowed slightly, and her lips pressed together in concentration. It was clear she was fully present, completely absorbed in the music. Every nuance mattered, every note carried intention. The audience could feel it, even if they could not articulate why. There was a kind of magic in the way she connected with the piano, as if the instrument were a bridge between her heart and everyone listening. The famous pianist found himself learning from her, not in a formal sense, but in the way she expressed emotion through technique. He had spent years mastering difficult compositions, performing under pressure, and studying the works of legendary musicians. Yet he had rarely seen someone combine technical skill with emotional depth so effortlessly. Her music was alive, breathing with her every movement, and the audience was being carried along with it. He realized that this was what true artistry looked like, not just playing the right notes, but making them matter. The audience's reaction grew more intense as the piece progressed. There was a sense of anticipation in the air, a collective energy that seemed to pulse with every note. People were leaning closer to hear the subtle dynamics, following the shifts in tempo, and marveling at the control she displayed. Some were smiling softly, moved by the beauty of the music, while others appeared to be on the verge of tears. It was as if the hall itself were holding its breath, suspended in a moment that felt timeless. The woman's hands moved faster now, navigating a series of challenging sequences that demanded full attention and precision. She played with confidence and grace, letting the rhythm guide her while maintaining control over every note. The audience was mesmerized, some leaning forward with wide eyes, others closing their eyes to absorb the sound fully. The children in the front row were completely still, as if they were afraid to blink and miss a single moment of the unfolding music. Adults, too, were captivated, some gripping the edges of their seats, others pressing their hands to their hearts. The famous pianist could not look away. He had expected a performance that would be entertaining at best, but what he was witnessing was extraordinary. The music was not just technically impressive. It was deeply moving. Every chord she struck carried emotion. Every pause created tension and anticipation. She had taken a simple act, a playful suggestion to perform, and transformed it into a moment that touched everyone in the room. He realized that he had never truly understood the power of music until he saw her play Dot as the piece reached its climax. The woman allowed herself to be fully expressive. Her hands moved with intensity and passion, creating a sound that filled every corner of the hall. The audience was completely captivated, their attention fully absorbed. Some were leaning forward, mouths slightly open in amazement, while others were closing their eyes, letting the music wash over them. There was a sense of awe in the room, a recognition that they were witnessing something rare and remarkable. The famous pianist stepped closer, unable to contain his admiration. He watched as her fingers danced across the keys with precision and elegance, each note carrying a depth of feeling that was almost tangible. He had called her on stage as a joke, expecting laughter or polite applause, and instead, he had been given a masterclass in artistry and emotion. He realized that true talent could appear anywhere in anyone, and that it had the power to move people in ways that words could never capture. The woman's performance began to slow, the notes softening, becoming gentle whispers that lingered in the air. The audience leaned in, listening intently, captivated by the subtlety and grace of her playing. The hall was filled with a quiet energy, a sense of connection between the performer and the listeners that transcended words. People felt as though they were part of something sacred, something that could not be replicated or forgotten. As the final notes of the piece resonated through the hall, there was a moment of silence. The audience held their breath, savoring the lingering sound, reluctant to break the spell that had been cast. Then, slowly, the applause began. It started softly, polite at first, but quickly grew into a thunderous wave of appreciation. People rose from their seats, cheering and clapping, some whistling, others calling out words of admiration. The energy in the hall was electric, filled with awe and excitement. The woman lifted her hands from the keys, breathing deeply, feeling a sense of relief and satisfaction. She had given everything to the music, and the response was overwhelming. She looked out at the audience, seeing their astonishment, their admiration, and their joy. It was a moment of connection, one that transcended the boundaries of performance and audience. She had shared a piece of herself through her music, and the audience had responded with genuine appreciation. The famous pianist approached her, clapping along with the rest of the audience. His expression was one of respect and admiration, a recognition of the extraordinary talent she had displayed. He had intended the moment as a joke, but she had completely transformed it into a performance that would be remembered long after the concert ended. He realized that he had underestimated her, and the realization humbled him. The audience continued to cheer, their energy filling the hall, creating a sense of shared excitement and wonder. People exchanged glances, whispering words of amazement, still trying to comprehend what they had witnessed. Some wiped tears from their eyes, others shook their heads in disbelief. Everyone present knew that they had seen something rare and beautiful, a performance that would stay with them for years to come. The woman, still at the piano, felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. She had stepped onto the stage as a surprise. You. The hall had begun to settle, but the energy of the audience remained palpable, hanging in the air like a gentle vibration. People whispered to each other, exchanging amazed glances and murmured compliments, trying to put into words what they had just experienced. Yet no words seemed adequate. The woman at the piano had transformed a playful moment into a performance that touched everyone, moving hearts in ways that were both subtle and profound. She remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the keys, feeling the weight of the applause and the lingering presence of the music that had just filled the space. She took a slow, calming breath, allowing herself to soak in the moment. Her mind was racing, yet clear, focused on the next step. She had come to the concert to enjoy the music, not to perform. And now she was facing a room full of people who had witnessed her talent unexpectedly. There was an odd mixture of humility and confidence within her. She knew her skill, but she had never imagined it could create such an impact, especially in a room full of seasoned listeners. The realization made her heart beat a little faster, not with anxiety, but with a deep sense of purpose. The famous pianist, who had initially invited her up as a joke, had returned to the edge of the stage. His face was a mixture of admiration and curiosity. He had spent years performing for critical audiences, always confident in his own abilities. Yet now he was witnessing something that challenged his understanding of music and talent. He couldn't take his eyes off her as she prepared for the next piece. Something about the way she approached the piano, with quiet grace and measured confidence, suggested that she had more to offer. And he was eager to see it. The woman's fingers hovered briefly above the keys before she began a new piece, this one slower and more introspective. Each note seemed to linger longer in the air, filling the hall with a delicate resonance that captured the attention of every listener. People leaned forward instinctively, drawn to the music, drawn to the emotion she was channeling. The sound was intimate yet powerful, commanding attention without demanding it. There was a sense of vulnerability in her playing, a willingness to expose her emotions. And the audience responded in kind as she continued. She allowed herself to explore subtle variations in tempo and tone, adding layers of depth to the melody. Her fingers moved lightly, but with precision, shaping each phrase to convey the story she wanted to tell. There was no need for exaggeration or showmanship. The music itself was enough, and the audience could feel it, a shared understanding that went beyond applause or polite acknowledgement. Each note was a bridge, connecting her heart to theirs, creating a moment of shared humanity that few performances could achieve. The famous pianist, still standing quietly, was visibly affected. He had seen countless musicians over the years, yet few had left such an impression on him. He observed her closely, noting the subtle shifts in her posture, the way her hands hovered above the keys before striking each note, and the emotion that flowed naturally through her music. He realized that her talent went beyond technical skill. It was the depth of feeling, the honesty, and the connection to the audience that made her extraordinary. He had called her to the stage as a joke, but she had become the highlight of the evening. The audience, too, was fully captivated. Whispers had ceased, replaced by rapt attention. Children sat still, fascinated, while adults closed their eyes, letting the music wash over them. Some leaned forward, gripping the edges of their seats, while others rested their hands lightly on their laps, absorbing every subtle nuance. The hall had transformed from a space of expectation to a sanctuary of emotion, where each person felt a personal connection to the performance. It was a rare and fragile magic, one that could not be forced or replicated. The woman's focus remained unwavering. She felt the audience's energy, the curiosity and wonder that filled the room, but she did not let it distract her. She allowed herself to be guided by the music, letting it flow naturally from her thoughts and emotions. The piece she played now was more challenging than the previous ones, demanding not just technical skill, but emotional intelligence. She navigated it with ease, her fingers gliding over the keys, her body moving subtly with the rhythm. It was as if she and the piano were in perfect harmony, each responding to the other with a quiet understanding. The famous pianist stepped slightly closer, unable to resist the pull of the music. He had spent years perfecting his craft, performing under pressure, and teaching others to achieve technical excellence. Yet what he was witnessing now was beyond technique. It was artistry, pure and unfiltered, the kind of performance that leaves a lasting impression on anyone fortunate enough to witness it. He could feel the connection between her and the audience, and he realized that this was something he had rarely experienced, a moment of pure, shared emotion brought to life through music. The melody began to build, moving from delicate, soft passages to more powerful, resonant chords. The audience felt the intensity grow, leaning forward, holding their breath as she guided them through the rising and falling waves of sound. There was a rhythm to it that seemed to mirror the heartbeat of the hall itself. Every note was deliberate, every pause meaningful, and the audience responded instinctively. Some whispered in awe, while others simply sat, mesmerized, unable to look away. She transitioned seamlessly between sections, each shift natural and emotionally compelling. There was a story in the music, one that spoke of struggle, hope, and triumph, yet it was universal enough that everyone could interpret it in their own way. The audience followed her journey, caught in a web of sound and feeling. Even the famous pianist was moved, taking a step back to fully absorb the depth of the performance. He had called her on stage as a playful gesture, and instead, he had witnessed a masterful display of artistry that left him humbled as the piece reached its climax. The woman's hands moved with a graceful intensity that drew gasps from the audience. The chords rang out with clarity and emotion, filling every corner of the hall. People leaned closer, their eyes wide, some pressing their hands to their hearts, feeling the music resonate deep within. It was a powerful, immersive experience, one that transcended the ordinary boundaries of performance. She had taken a single instrument and turned it into a vessel for emotion, expression, and connection. The famous pianist was now completely engrossed. He watched her fingers dance across the keys, noting the fluidity and precision. But more importantly, he observed the emotion that infused every note. This was not a performance designed to impress. It was a conversation, a story told through sound, and the audience was listening intently. He realized that true artistry was not just about mastery of technique, but about the ability to communicate, to make others feel, to create moments that linger long after the music ends. The audience was silent as the piece reached its final notes. The sound hung in the air, delicate and resonant, allowing every listener to absorb the full impact of what they had just heard. There was a collective understanding, a recognition that they had witnessed something rare, something extraordinary. The applause, when it finally came, was thunderous and heartfelt. People rose from their seats, cheering, clapping, and whistling, unable to contain their admiration. The energy in the hall was electric, filled with awe and wonder. The woman lifted her hands from the keys, breathing deeply, feeling both relief and exhilaration. She had given everything she had to the music, and the audience's response was overwhelming. She looked out at the crowd, seeing the astonishment, the admiration, and the joy in every face. It was a moment of connection that went beyond performance, beyond applause. She had shared a piece of herself, and it had been received with gratitude and awe. The famous pianist approached her, clapping along with the audience, his expression one of genuine respect. The playful joke he had intended had turned into a moment of revelation. He realized that he had underestimated her entirely. Her talent was extraordinary, and her ability to connect with people through music was rare. He nodded slightly, acknowledging her skill, and the audience responded with renewed applause. Recognizing the mutual respect between the two musicians, people in the audience were still talking quietly, exchanging their thoughts and impressions. Some tried to guess her background, wondering how someone unknown could possess such talent. Others simply shook their heads in disbelief, still processing the emotional journey they had experienced. Children whispered to their parents, amazed at the performance, while adults discussed the technical brilliance and emotional depth they had just witnessed. The hall was alive with conversation, but there was a shared understanding that words alone could not capture what had just happened. The woman remained at the piano, smiling faintly, feeling a sense of quiet satisfaction. She had faced the stage without expectation, without preparation, and yet she had managed to touch hundreds of people with her music. The applause, the admiration, and the awe were evidence of the connection she had created, a bond forged in a single evening of shared experience. She understood that this was a rare gift, one that could not be taken for granted, and she felt gratitude for the opportunity to share it. The famous pianist stepped back, allowing the audience to continue their appreciation. He had learned something important, that the hall had settled into a calm that felt almost sacred after the intensity of the previous performances. The audience, still buzzing with admiration and disbelief, remained seated, their eyes reflecting the lingering magic of the evening. People whispered to one another, sharing their amazement, but there was a common thread running through their words. No one had expected to witness something so extraordinary. The woman at the piano, once a playful joke in the mind of a famous musician, had become the heart and soul of the evening. She had transformed the room, the people, and even the famous pianist himself. She sat quietly, her hands resting gently on the keys, allowing herself a moment of stillness. The adrenaline that had fueled her through the performances was slowly ebbing, replaced by a sense of profound satisfaction. Every note she had played had been an expression of who she was, yet she had also felt the pulse of the audience with every chord. She realized that music was more than technique or practice. It was a language that connected people, an invisible thread that could weave hearts together in a shared moment of understanding. The famous pianist finally stepped forward, his usual playful smile replaced by one of genuine admiration. He approached her slowly, clapping lightly at first, then louder as the audience joined him. There was a quiet respect in the way he moved, a recognition that he had underestimated her talent in the most profound way. The joke he had intended had completely backfired, but not in humiliation. It had backfired in revelation. He had discovered a rare brilliance, one that could not be ignored or replicated. The woman glanced at him briefly, acknowledging his presence with a small, humble nod. There was no need for words. They both understood the gravity of the evening. He had called her to the stage expecting laughter or polite applause, and instead, she had shared her heart, her soul, and her extraordinary gift with hundreds of people. The applause of the audience filled the room once again, a wave of appreciation that seemed to lift the very air. It was loud, heartfelt, and uncontainable. People were on their feet, cheering, clapping, and whistling, and the energy of the hall was electric. She took a deep breath, allowing the sound to wash over her. It was overwhelming, yes, but also affirming. She had never sought recognition, never sought to impress anyone. Music had always been a private sanctuary, a place where she could express herself without judgment. Yet tonight, that sanctuary had expanded to include everyone in the hall. She had shared something deeply personal, and the audience had responded with awe and gratitude. It was a humbling experience, one that left her feeling both vulnerable and proud. The famous pianist stepped closer to the piano, now fully engaged with what had unfolded. He had seen countless performances in his lifetime, yet very few had left such an impression on him. Her music was not merely about skill or speed. It was about emotion, storytelling, and connection. Each note carried intention, each pause had weight, and every subtle shift in dynamics seemed to communicate directly with the hearts of the audience. He realized that she had turned a single instrument into a vessel for human experience. And that was something extraordinary. The audience continued to cheer, many still rising to their feet, clapping and calling out words of admiration. Some had tears in their eyes, others were laughing quietly in disbelief, and nearly everyone was smiling, caught in the joy of the moment. Children whispered to their parents, amazed at the beauty they had witnessed, while adults discussed the technical mastery and emotional depth that had been displayed. The atmosphere was filled with wonder, and it was clear that no one in the hall would forget this evening any time soon. The woman, still seated at the piano, felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. She had faced the stage without expectation, unsure of how she would be received, and yet she had captivated everyone. She had transformed what had started as a playful joke into an unforgettable evening, filled with emotion, connection, and artistry. The applause, admiration, and awe were proof that her music had reached people in a way words could not. She understood, perhaps for the first time, the true power of her gift, the ability to touch hearts, inspire emotions, and create shared experiences. The famous pianist, now standing closer to the front, clapped along with the audience. His expression was one of genuine respect, and there was a quiet humility in his stance. He had always been confident in his own talent, accustomed to being the center of attention, and yet tonight he had witnessed someone who had eclipsed expectations entirely. The lesson was clear. Talent could appear in unexpected places, and the most profound performances often came from those who played with authenticity, emotion, and courage rather than ego or pride. As the applause began to ebb, a few people in the audience began to approach the stage, still hesitant but eager to show their appreciation. Some carried small flowers, others simply offered words of praise, and a few shyly asked for autographs or photographs. The woman accepted their admiration with grace, offering gentle smiles and quiet words of thanks. She did not seek the attention, but she recognized the value of the connection she had created. Every interaction, every word of gratitude, reinforced the sense that she had shared something meaningful. The famous pianist finally spoke, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He congratulated her on her performance, acknowledging the depth of skill and artistry she had displayed. The audience listened quietly, many nodding in agreement, recognizing the truth in his words. He admitted that he had called her to the stage as a joke, and yet she had completely transformed the moment into something beyond imagination. His acknowledgement carried weight, not just for the woman at the piano, but for everyone witnessing the exchange. It was a reminder that talent and artistry could exist anywhere, often in the most unexpected forms. The woman responded with humility, thanking him and the audience for their support. She spoke softly, her voice calm yet filled with sincerity. She explained that music had always been her way of expressing herself, of telling stories without words, and that sharing it with others brought her joy. The audience listened attentively, many nodding, moved not only by her words, but by the honesty and warmth behind them. It was a reminder that true talent was not just about skill, but about the ability to connect, inspire, and communicate in ways that transcended technique. After a moment of reflection, the woman returned to the piano. She played a final, short piece, a simple melody, delicate and heartfelt. The notes were soft yet resonant, carrying a sense of closure and reflection. The audience listened in hushed awe, as if unwilling to break the spell that had been cast. Each note seemed to linger, echoing through the hall, leaving a lasting impression. It was a quiet, intimate moment after the intensity of the previous performances, and it was received with deep appreciation. When the final note faded, there was a moment of silence, a pause that allowed the audience to fully absorb what they had just witnessed. And then, once again, the applause erupted. This time, it was not only loud and enthusiastic, but filled with a profound sense of gratitude. People rose to their feet, cheering, clapping, and whistling, their faces reflecting joy, amazement, and admiration. The energy in the hall was electric, yet gentle, a shared recognition of something extraordinary that had been created in that room. The famous pianist approached the woman one last time, offering a handshake and a sincere smile. There was no need for further words. The mutual respect was clear. He had learned something invaluable that evening, not only about music, but about humility, recognition, and the unpredictable ways talent can appear. The audience could see the exchange, and many cheered again, celebrating not just the performance, but the connection that had formed between two musicians from very different worlds. People began to make their way toward the exit slowly, still discussing the evening in quiet tones. Some lingered, reluctant to leave, while others replayed the performance in their minds, savoring the memory. The hall, which had been filled with laughter, applause, and whispers, was now settling into a calm, reflective atmosphere. The impact of the performance was evident in every face, every gesture, and every conversation. It was clear that the evening had left a lasting impression, one that would be remembered for years to come. The woman finally stood from the piano, taking a moment to look around the hall. She felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense of completion, and an awareness that something significant had occurred. She had stepped onto the stage as a playful suggestion, uncertain of the outcome, and had left as someone who had shared her heart with hundreds of people. The applause, admiration, and awe were all signs that she had succeeded, not in seeking recognition, but in touching lives through the universal language of music. The famous pianist watched her one last time, his expression reflecting a mix of respect and humility. He had thought the evening would be light-hearted and entertaining, and yet he had been given an unforgettable lesson. Talent, he realized, was not measured by reputation or expectation, but by authenticity, courage, and the ability to connect with others. The woman had demonstrated this in a way that transcended the stage, leaving everyone present with a memory that would remain vivid for the rest of their lives. As the audience slowly departed, still discussing the extraordinary events, the woman lingered